Welcome to the Philly Prime Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Schratweiser. This week, the hottest state in the country for presidential and U.S. Senate candidates. Bruce Gordon joins us from Fox News, political expert, analyst, call him what you will, my former colleague at Fox. Bruce, it doesn't get any hotter than the state of Pennsylvania right now in the race for president and the U.S. Senate between Bob Casey and Dave McCormick. Give me your thoughts on just how hot this is right now.
Well, it's on everyone's radar. It is the state, yes, technically a commonwealth, but we'll call it a state for purposes of our discussion
Sure.
here. It is the hottest state. It's the state with the most electoral votes up for grabs. Interestingly, Pennsylvania has been shedding electoral votes now for decades. In fact, probably close to a century or so. And we are now down to 19 electoral votes, but that's still more than any of the other so-called swing states. And those swing states are in shorter and shorter list of them as each passing election comes along. And so this time around, you have really no more than about 7 swing states that the candidates are focusing on, kind of spread throughout the country. Arizona and Nevada out west, and Georgia, North Carolina in the south, and of course Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin in the north and northeast and so forth. But that's basically it. Pretty much every other one of the 50 states, you could predict today what will happen come November, and you'd be pretty much guaranteed to be right. So Pennsylvania is the biggest prize, and so it's garnered the most attention, the most money, the most visits by the candidates by a wide margin.
Yeah.
And that makes us sort of the center of the political landscape, the political universe for the time being.
Let's talk about that a little bit. Everybody's been doing whistle stops here in Pennsylvania, even in Philadelphia or out in the Western. Trump's been to Butler twice after the assassination attempt the first time. He came back a second time. Harris was in Bucks County just the other day doing a big event. Then she did the Fox News interview up in Bucks County. They're crisscrossing the state, spending a lot of time here. Could it all come down to Pennsylvania, Bruce, at the end of the day come election night?
Oh, it absolutely could. And one of the things, and perhaps we can talk about this in a little more detail as we go through our conversation, but one of the things that we can pretty much guarantee, folks, is that we are unlikely to have an answer to who won Pennsylvania on election night itself. For a brief little lecture here, we'll keep it short
on
how
counting votes.
On how these things work. The reality is that under state law, the mail-in ballots may not be processed. That is kind of fully opened up as a full process, a kind of by hand process for these mail-in votes. They have to be opened up. There's 2 envelopes. They have to be flattened out so they can be read properly. It's a time-consuming process when you have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of mail-in votes. We know those votes are going to lean heavily Democrat because the Democrats push mail-in voting. Republicans generally do not. So it is entirely possible that come election night, you will see a scenario in which it would appear that Donald Trump leads because the in-person, that is day of election votes are counted first. They can be counted fastest. And so it will look in the early stages of the evening, once the polls close at 8 Eastern, that Donald Trump leads the race. Throughout the course of the evening, as we get more and more of the mail-in votes counted and into the next morning, that's when you're going to see the tide turn. Now, whether it turns enough for Kamala Harris to win Pennsylvania, that's anybody's guess. But one thing is very clear. Republicans are going to be thrilled with the early results, Democrats more so the later results. And it will again appear as though Democrats are coming storming back at the last minute. In fact, we're actually cast first, right? These are mail-in votes that were cast days, sometimes weeks earlier, but they don't get touched, they don't get counted until somewhat later in the process. So it's entirely possible we won't know who won Pennsylvania on election night itself. Here's a scenario that's absolutely possible on election night. You'll recall that this election in 2024 encapsulates the changes in the Electoral College that would come about because of the once every decade census that happens, right? So that's why, for example, Pennsylvania, after the 2020 census, there wouldn't have been time to enact these in time for the 2020 election. But for this election, Pennsylvania has 19 electoral votes instead of the 20 they had. So when you take all that into consideration, if Kamala Harris were to simply hold on of the 7 swing states, or 6 actually, she didn't win North Carolina, or Biden didn't win North Carolina last time around. But if she held on to just Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin this time around, she would win the Electoral College vote 270 to 268. Now, how's that for crazy? And the
Doesn't
only
get
reason
any
she would,
more razor thin than that.
well, and the only reason she would win 270 to 268 is because both Maine and Nebraska, as you may know, count their electoral votes a little differently. It's not a full winner take all in
Yeah.
Maine or in Nebraska. You get the two, if you win the popular vote in the states, you get their two electoral votes. We call those sort of the Senate electoral votes. And then each individual congressional district is, you can capture that even if you didn't win the state. So that's only
Yeah.
important because in Nebraska, for example, Kamala Harris is likely to win one of their 5 electoral votes. Donald Trump would get the other 4 almost certainly. But if she gets that one vote, that's the Omaha area, more blue
Right.
than red. If she
Mhm.
wins that, she'd be 270 to 268. On the
Mm.
other hand, of course, in Maine, likely to go for the Democrat, but Donald Trump is likely to pick up one of their 2 congressional races, congressional districts, and get a vote there. The upshot is this could be monumentally close. And yet another bit of screwiness with the Electoral College. Why would you have an even number of electoral votes, right? So that you could literally have a
Yeah.
269 to 269 tie.
Yeah.
I don't know that the founding fathers were at their best when they decided that.
Quickly, 60 Minutes did a piece the other night. Interviewed Al Schmidt, who runs the elections in Pennsylvania, and Josh Shapiro. I didn't hear a lot of encouraging news that the votes will get counted any faster than they did in 2020, which took almost 4 days, I remember last time. And they
Yeah.
talked about that. Nothing has changed because the legislature hasn't changed it. It is a cumbersome process, as they actually showed on the show how they open the first envelope, the second envelope, unfold that, and they can't
Right,
start
flatten it
counting
out,
till
right.
till the polls are closed. So
Well,
that
actually, they can start processing,
more,
right? They can start
yes,
processing when they open, but right, you're
right,
absolutely right. It takes time.
yeah,
And I thought I actually saw the piece that you're
yeah,
referring to, the 60 Minutes piece. I thought they could have done a better job, frankly, in explaining
that's where I was
the
going. Go ahead.
real conundrum here again, and that is that issue that it's going to appear as though
Hmm.
Democrats have come storming back. You'll recall vividly,
Hmm.
I know, that in 2020, Donald Trump felt that Pennsylvania had been stolen from him in part because, yes, he led early on in the counting, and
Right,
then Joe Biden comes storming back. Well, again, it's only storming back because of the order in which these things were counted.
right.
The ballots were cast exactly the opposite way, but it looked like a come from behind victory stolen by the Democrats, at least to Donald Trump's way of looking at it.
Yeah, let's talk about one other thing I saw this week. On several shows, I'm pretty sure I saw them say that the number of Democrats requesting mail-in ballots this time around are down by 400,000 in
Hmm.
Pennsylvania. Um, if that's true, and I think this race is a lot closer than people thought it was going to be in Pennsylvania this time around. If that's true, what kind of impact would that have if not as many Democrats decided to ask for a mail-in ballot and voted with the mail-in ballots? Will that make
Well,
the
again,
process faster? Could narrow it down more?
I mean, you can parse this stuff a million ways, Dave. I think one
Sure.
of the things that when you have a super close race, and the latest
Hmm.
polling averages show Kamala Harris over Donald Trump by less than a percentage point. Now, that's
Right.
taking several of the latest
Hmm.
reasonably legitimate polls because there's all kinds of junk polls out
Oh
there.
yeah.
But there are sites that try to figure out, all right, these are the legitimate sites that have a pretty good track record. So
Hmm.
she's up by a razor thin margin. What does that mean? Well, it's hard to say for one reason. I mean, one possible explanation could be the Democrats, for example, who are again pushed to vote by mail in 2020 in the middle of a pandemic, no
Right.
longer feel the need to vote by mail, and they will
Right.
simply show up on election day. On the
Yeah.
other hand, it could absolutely mean that there's sort of an enthusiasm gap there. There's a deficiency in
Yep.
enthusiasm among Democrats. That's also possible. There have been a couple of stories just in the last few days,
Hmm.
and these stories tend to sort of build on another. When one media outlet reports something, a couple of others jump aboard. But there's
Right.
been some discussion of a lack of coordination and communication between the national folks on the Kamala Harris team and the Philadelphia folks. Obviously,
Okay.
Philadelphia is massively important. Democrats must run up the score there in Philadelphia, or they simply will not win. And even running up the score, they guarantee they'll win Pennsylvania, but they must
Sure.
run up the score to have a shot to win.
Still 7-1 Democrats in Philadelphia over Republicans in terms of registered voters.
Yeah,
7.
it's probably arguably worse than that,
Okay.
in terms of the imbalance. The Republican Party, as we know, has almost disappeared in the city of Philadelphia, and I've
Yeah.
talked at length about this in the past. I don't think it's good for the population at large when either party is so dominant that there isn't a really robust discussion and debate about the issues.
Right.
I don't like it when Republicans dominate. I don't like it when Democrats dominate. I think there's
Yeah.
something to be said for kind of keeping things in the middle,
In
where
balance.
you
Yeah.
have to be reasonable, you have to be moderate to get anything done. It's an
Yeah.
interesting thing, Dave. I was just checking myself this morning as I thought I knew the answer, and shockingly enough, it turned out I was right. Um, we call Pennsylvania a purple state or purple Commonwealth.
Right.
In fact, of the 67 counties, there were only 9 counties in which, in 2020 at least, there
Yeah.
was a 10 percentage point or less margin. Several of them right in our area, Bucks County being a great
Right.
example.
Hmm.
But the point is, it's a purple Commonwealth, but it's made up of deep red and deep blue areas. There are really very few areas that are truly purple,
Yeah.
meaning kind of moderate government. You've got in Bucks County, of course, Brian Fitzpatrick, the
Yep.
moderate Republican in Congress there. You must be a moderate to win in those kinds of places. But there aren't many of them in Pennsylvania. There aren't many of them left.
Let's talk about issues in Pennsylvania. Are they the same as they are across the country, where we have the economy first or immigration first and the economy second, and then we have the abortion issue? The Democrats seem to be very focused on the abortion issue, both in the presidential race in Pennsylvania, and we'll get to this in the U.S. Senate race with Dave McCormick and Bob Casey. Do you see them stacked that way? Is it, to me, it's the economy, stupid, all the time is the first issue.
Yeah.
Immigration is a very tight second, maybe, and then the abortion issue. There, how do you see that? Are those the 3 big issues, and how would you rank them?
Yeah, I mean, they probably are. I think one of the things that's interesting, and I've been reading about this in the last couple of days and weeks, and that is what's referred to as the nationalization of politics. And there's been a lot written about this idea that while there are some issues that are maybe unique to Pennsylvania versus, say, Nevada or Arizona, the reality is that many of these campaigns really nationalize things. They're always, say, Democrats, for example, are always invoking the specter of a second Donald Trump term. And so there's this national focus. Even, say, in the Senate race, you'll see this kind of thing happening to the point where I do think when we nationalize some of these races, you sometimes get folks voting for candidates who they otherwise wouldn't come near with a 10-foot pole, but
Hmm.
they say to themselves, all right, this guy's not exactly a leader. He's not somebody I would have voted for otherwise, but he's got the R after his name, or he's got the D after his name, and that means he's on my team. And when the big votes come up in Congress on the important issues, he's going to vote with my team and, generally speaking, in line with my views. I don't know what he thinks about some local issue here.
Sure.
I wish I was in agreement with him. I'm not sure I am. But on the big national issues, that's what people seem to be focusing on these days.
Yeah.
You mentioned abortion, for example. Democrats have been running on and having some pretty good success over the last several off-year elections. Whenever there's been a referendum or a special
Hmm.
election and so forth, even the midterms, running on that issue. Meanwhile, Republicans, of course, have worked the immigration angle hard. Obviously, immigration means probably more to folks in Arizona, for example, than it does, say, in Pennsylvania.
Hmm.
Doesn't mean that people aren't concerned in Pennsylvania, but obviously they're not literally and figuratively on the front lines of that particular issue. But the short answer to your question is, I think local issues have become less and less important. You can stick somebody with a,
Sure.
in Pennsylvania, you were against fracking and now you're for fracking, and that'll get you a little ways. But
Yeah.
generally speaking, these races have all been nationalized.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about the ads. There's been a ton of them. The only people getting rich on those are the television stations in Philadelphia and around the state. They're making
Not the
millions on these
employees at
ads.
those television stations, right?
Yes,
Just
sir.
the
Yes, which we used to be part of, but we're not now. But you sort of still are, kind of thing. But I mean, they're spending millions and millions and millions of dollars on ads in Pennsylvania. Have any of them stuck out? Give me one, if you can, from each side, for Trump and for Harris. Harris,
Well,
I'm assuming, if you want to go first, you pick
well,
which one you want to go
it's
first.
interesting. It's interesting. Not just the ads, but first of all, the short answer to the question is it is astounding the
Yeah,
amount of money that will be spent on this election this year on both sides. And the vast majority of that going to television ads. You literally can't turn on your television without being
sure.
bombarded
Oh,
with
yeah,
political ads. And
yeah,
obviously, different parts of the country want different kinds of things or think different kinds of things will work.
right,
Example, I was just down in the South Carolina area, around the Hilton Head area recently, and Savannah, Georgia. That's the Savannah, Georgia television market. And in
right,
Georgia, the commercial that was on heavy rotation from Donald Trump's allies was the commercial that had Kamala Harris talking about providing transgender
right,
surgeries and so forth for
yeah,
prison inmates, a
right.
position that she had taken a number of years ago and has come back to haunt her. I would argue on the campaign trail, but that's one of those classic sort of culture war issues that's going to play very well in a place like Georgia. And certainly in South Carolina for other benefits. South Carolina is certainly going to go
Sure.
for Trump under any circumstance. But the point is that works big in a place like that. Now, is transgender surgery for a prison inmate a major issue for the vast majority of Americans, given how incredibly infrequently that's likely to happen?
Hmm.
No. But it suggests that this is someone who's out of touch with
Yeah.
the American people, out of touch with what we ought to be doing. And so that ad plays big there. And it was on an
And it's gotten a lot of
NBC,
play
for
here.
example.
Actually, it's gotten a lot of play also in Pennsylvania. I
Yeah.
see that ad probably at least once a day, twice a day if I'm watching a lot of TV. I don't watch a lot of TV now, but
Yeah.
at nighttime I do. I watch a few of the national shows. That's getting a lot of play here too. That same ad.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. And, look, after a while, the science of this whole advertising for political ads is, supposedly that you have to see these ads many times before they stick.
Yeah.
And I don't doubt that that's true. The first time you see a commercial for your local fast food restaurant or whatever, you may not pay attention. The fifth or sixth time you see it, now it
Yeah.
catches your attention, and so forth. The
Hmm.
problem is that the 500th time that you've seen it, by now you're sick to death of it, and you wish the
Yeah.
thing would just go away.
Right.
And I
Anything
suspect many people
on the
tune it out.
Yeah. Anything on the Harris side that you think is kind of sticking here
I
in
think,
Pennsylvania?
well, just the broad theme that they've been going after for a while, and again, I think there's sort of a law of diminishing returns there too. The idea that
Okay.
Donald Trump is a threat to democracy itself, that the basic idea of democracy is under threat from Donald Trump. Now, you may very well believe that, and there's certainly evidence to suggest that some of Mr. Trump's views and some of his actions, certainly in the aftermath of the last election, makes that a legitimate issue. I
Sure.
don't think you're going to convince anyone who's already a Donald Trump supporter, for example,
Right.
that he's a terrible guy who's going to lead to the end of the world. And I'm
Mm.
not so sure that those moderates, that thin slice in the middle, are convinced by the repeated questioning. For example, at
Yeah.
the vice presidential debate,
Yeah.
J.D. Vance, did Donald Trump lose the election in 2020? And he danced around and danced around and danced around, never really answered it. Finally,
Yeah.
at a rally just yesterday or the day before, said, no, I don't think he did lose the election, which is fundamentally false. He
Mhm.
absolutely lost the election. But of
Mhm.
course, he's not going to say that. I only mention that to say that I don't know that anyone who cares about that issue hasn't already baked it into their thinking.
Sure.
And even the independent voter says, all right, you told me that. I know these guys aren't admitting that Donald Trump lost, in part because if they did so, they would be excommunicated from the party and would be subject to all kinds of verbal
Mhm.
abuse from Mr. Trump himself. So I get that, but I'm not so sure that pounding that into their heads for the 9,000th time really makes much progress. I think there may be other ways to go about that. I don't know that that's that effective at this point.
Okay. Harris has taken a lot of heat, and the campaign has taken a lot of heat the last few days for not appealing to African American men and kind of pandering or not talking down, but trying to win their vote. There was some comments by Barack Obama. There was some Bill Clinton comments. There's been some plan for young black men that she came out with the other day, a 5-part plan
Mhm.
Some of the reverberation from that is that African American males aren't taking too kindly to that kind of approach. Uh, in Pennsylvania, where does that stack up, do you think?
Well, look, I think in any kind of message to any kind of group, you've got to have the right. The message may be fine. We can
Yep.
debate that, but it's
Hmm.
also important who's the messenger, right? So, for example, Tim Walz may be effective in many areas in many communities. I don't know that an older Midwestern white governor is the right messenger for that kind of
Right.
message to
Hmm.
young African American men, for example.
Sure.
And so you have to have the right messenger. Look, there's who knows what the turnout will be. Young black men do not tend to turn out as thoroughly and in as great a numbers as some other groups and some other age groups and some other demographics and so forth. Um, all the Harris camp has to know is that they simply must run up the score in Philadelphia for them to have a chance in Pennsylvania. And so they've got to pick the right messenger for that. And it has to look and sound legitimately like you're not just pandering, like
Yeah.
someone didn't just get in your ear and say, oh, you're ignoring these people. Well, now get out and start talking to them. We're
Sure.
late in the game for that. And if that's a real issue, if young black men don't feel like they're being really listened to, and if they
Yeah.
feel like they're being talked down to or pandered to,
Yeah.
that's a problem for the Harris campaign.
All right, you talked about the vice presidential debate. The thing that seemed to stick for J.D. Vance was in his closing statement about Harris and Walls kind of trying to walk away from the last 4 years in office. And he kept asking, and he hit the point 2 or 3 times, and again in his closing argument about what about the last 3.5 years? Is that when you throw that against the wall, is that sticking? Can she have these new positions or revamped positions or updated positions or turn the
Mhm.
page, move ahead
Pick
positions?
the euphemism you like, right?
Sure, this
Yeah.
I could go on. I will not. I won't bore everybody with that. But does that kind of thing stick too? When you throw that against the wall, does it stick?
Let me answer as somebody who follows this stuff closely.
Sure.
As someone who follows it closely, it doesn't stick at all because I don't believe that Kamala Harris was making decisions alongside Joe Biden any
Hmm.
more than I thought Mike Pence was making decisions alongside Donald Trump.
Donald Trump. Sure.
It is a delicate needle to try and thread to try and say, yes, I was not just sitting around twiddling my thumbs over the last 4 years. Look, Mike Pence wanted to run this time and, of course, got
Sure.
nowhere, but he was going to run. So, what do you say about the previous 4 years? You obviously didn't speak up against your own administration while you're in office. That would be unheard of. So, the
Yeah.
assumption is you were in support of what the administration was doing, even when they made obvious missteps. So, the question of and she's been doing this now for weeks, trying to delicately separate herself from some of the more unpopular positions within the Biden administration without completely throwing the administration under the bus. Because then you
Although,
get this message, hey,
yeah,
if you thought it was so bad, why did you stick in with him and why didn't you speak up, before? So it's
yeah.
a delicate dance she has to do.
All right. But in the Brett Baer interview the other night on Fox, she made it very clear that the Harris administration will not be a continuation
Mhm.
of the Biden presidency. So she
And
kind
that's the
of
strongest way she has phrased that yet.
That's why I
That
brought it
was,
up. I mean,
yeah,
of
one of the
all the stuff I've
takeaways.
heard
Yeah,
her say, she
yeah,
kind of, as you said, delicately walks around that or steps over that to get
yeah,
to where she wants to go. But that's the closest. I mean, she's done the I'm not Joe Biden, obviously. I'm not Donald Trump either. I'm
right.
Harris. So my question there is, was that a good move to now 20 something days out, start walking away more quickly so that people get the message that it's going to be different if I'm the president?
Well, I guess I would say this, assuming it wasn't just a misstatement, just sort of
Sure.
getting trapped into going maybe farther than you want to. And look, none of these
Okay.
none of these folks are perfect in an interview
No.
setting, and
No.
sometimes they will indeed go
Mhm.
farther and farther out on the limb, so to speak,
Yeah.
than they might have wanted to. If they could have taken it back, they might have said, "Wow, I would have phrased that a little bit differently." But
Sure.
assuming that she meant that, it is a farther step away from the Biden administration, and that certainly suggests that she has to do that because sticking with the Biden administration on all of its policies, as if
Sure.
everything the Biden administration did over the last 4 years was wonderful, clearly that's not working. The American people don't believe that. And you and I have talked before, Dave, just as
Yeah.
an example, the
Mhm.
economy is, by most metrics, humming along quite well. I mean, very well. But inflation is still higher than people want it to be, even though inflation is down now. It
Hmm.
is still prices are still significantly higher than they were several years ago. And so you've got to figure out how you kind of dance around that. Now,
Hmm.
how much control does the White House have over prices and inflation? An economist will tell you they have very little. How much control does a vice president have over what's happening in the White House?
Yeah.
Again, a political guy will tell you not much, but that's the way it goes. That is how the
Yeah.
game is played. And if you were the vice president for the last 4 years, I'm tagging you with every misstep the administration made. Doesn't matter that you were just one of several voices in the room and you
Yeah.
might have suggested, let's do this. The president ultimately did this. Doesn't matter. You're part
Yeah.
of the administration. You take part of the blame.
As they head into the home stretch here, the Harris campaign seems intent now on continuing to throw darts at Donald Trump, his age, release his medical records. We don't think he's right. Listen to him. He's sounding kind of crazy. He's this, he's that. Um, Clearly, it sounds to me like looking for people who don't like Donald Trump to get them to the polls to vote for them, or to then or cast aspersions, obviously, about his ability. I would counter that the guy can do 3 or 4 states in one day, not one event every day like she's doing, or one and a half events, an interview and an event. And to do those kind of events in the spotlight every single day,
Mhm.
you have to have it together pretty good. So, having made my argument there, your thoughts about that strategy at the end here to start like going at Donald Trump in that direction, not on
I
the
don't
issues, but on that.
Yeah, I don't know how well that works for this reason, and I will push back some on your view just a moment
Sure.
ago. The reality with Donald Trump is that at this point, some of the objectively crazy, loony things that he says and does during a typical day are so baked into the cake that it barely registers an eye roll or a nod, a shaking of the head when he does it.
Sure.
Some of the things when he goes off on these tangents, and I will grant you, his energy level is fantastic, not only for a 78, 79-year-old man, but for anyone. The
Yeah.
energy that it takes to run for president, and this has been discussed ad nauseum, is almost greater than the energy it takes to be president.
Sure.
This is an incredible marathon that these folks are running. So his energy level, I don't think should be questioned. But some of the things, there was a long
Yeah.
digression in the middle of a speech where he talked about if he was on an electric boat and the boat was sinking, did he want to get electrocuted by the electric boat
Right.
battery or eaten by a shark?
Yeah.
And if someone else were to say that, you would have thought they were absolutely out of their minds and they'd be
Yeah.
immediately disqualified in your mind. When Donald
Hmm.
Trump says it, it's that's just Mr. Trump saying
Yeah.
kind of stuff he says.
And
So
that's how
I
Republicans
think
shrug
at
it
this
off.
point,
I mean, they say it's just Donald Trump being
exactly.
Donald Trump. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I don't know that you get all that far with that. I mean, obviously, it
Hmm.
doesn't get you anywhere with a Trump supporter, but the question is, does it
Yeah.
get you anywhere with that narrow slice in the middle?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure it does. Again, I think there is, Trump often talks about the media double standard, and that may well be true in some cases. I wouldn't argue, but there's also a double standard, again, in the sense that what would absolutely disqualify most candidates, whether they were Democrat or Republican, when
Mhm.
it's Donald Trump, just another day
Yeah.
at the office. Nobody blinks.
In these last 2 weeks here now, um, in Pennsylvania, nationally too, but let's look just at Pennsylvania. Who are the people that the Harris campaign has to go after, and who are the people that the Trump campaign has to go after in Pennsylvania to win Pennsylvania and those electoral votes? Because this could come down to not the popular vote, the electoral vote. We look at 2016 and then we look at 2020. Walk me
Yeah.
through that. What do you think in those last 2 weeks?
Well, we talked before at some length about, for example, from the Harris standpoint, to start off there, we talked for a little bit about the idea of having to run up the score in Philadelphia, but that's not enough. In
Hmm.
2016, Hillary Clinton won the city of Philadelphia by roughly 475,000 votes
Right.
and lost the state. 4 years later, in 2020, Joe Biden won Philadelphia by about 471,000 votes. So ever so small, ever so slightly smaller margin out of Philadelphia, but he won the state. Why did he win the state? Because his margin in the four collar counties, that is Bucks, Montgomery, Chester, Delaware, was
Hmm.
far larger than her margin. She won those 4 counties by an aggregate of about 189,000 votes. Biden won by about 293,000 votes.
Yep.
So that 100,000 vote benefit to Biden, that is how much better he did in those counties, pretty much entirely explains the difference between Clinton losing Pennsylvania by 40,000 votes, Biden winning Pennsylvania by 80,000 votes. All that
Sure.
is to say that those suburban voters around Philadelphia will be massively important. She must not only keep that big margin in Philly, she has to win big in those counties. Last time around, she won, or Joe Biden won all 4 of those collar counties, as did Clinton. But she has to maintain big margins there, and that's one of the reasons why for suburban women in particular, the issue of abortion keeps coming up over
Yep.
and over again. It's a vitally important issue for them, and arguably for lots of other folks as well, but particularly suburban women. So she has to pile up the numbers there. For Donald Trump, he knows Philadelphia is lost. If he can, hold his losses there to something not particularly embarrassing, he's
Right.
probably thrilled. He's got to try and knock down that margin in the collar counties around Philadelphia. There was a time when those counties were very competitive for Republicans, and they
Sure.
could mute their big loss in Philly with that. Those days are over, so he's got to do a little better there. But I think he also has to, frankly, just run up the score in all of the rural areas, all of the red areas. Donald Trump, 4 years ago, won 54 of Pennsylvania's 67 counties.
Hmm.
Basically, every small county in terms of population in Pennsylvania went for Donald Trump, often by massive margins, you know, 60-40, 70-30, 80-20 kind of margins. So he has to run up the score in a big way in those places, and not just run up the score in percentages. You've got to get people out to vote. And look,
Yeah.
both parties have done a job. You can like it or dislike it. Both parties have done a job so demonizing the other party that they have made it essentially sound as if you don't get out and vote for our team, for our guy, the end of the world is right around the corner.
Right.
So I don't doubt that there are enough voters on either side of this equation for either party to win Pennsylvania, but it then becomes a question of getting out your voters and making sure they actually get out and vote.
And I'm assuming the fracking drill baby drill message that he has wins those counties you're talking about for Trump. And
Sure.
the immigration issue and the economy, those three things seem to be the locomotive moving that train down the tracks towards what he hopes is a victory in Pennsylvania.
That whole upper tier of Pennsylvania, more or less right across, is all Trump country, except for, I mean, the extreme Northwest.
Yep.
Erie County was one of the counties that was, yeah, Biden won it by a percentage point last time around. So
Yep.
very close. But by and large, all that area, and that's a lot of that is fracking country,
Yep.
that is all Donald Trump territory. And again, he's got to do everything he can to get the turnout there because, again, when people look at election results, it's not about the percentage that you got in a community. It's
Right.
about the vote margin, the actual numbers that you got,
Yep.
and that's big.
Okay, let's move Harris and Trump to one side and talk about Bob Casey and Dave McCormick. I think that race is a little closer than folks thought it was going to be. It looks also within like 3 percentage points. Sometimes it looks like it's a little less. Sometimes it's a little bit more.
Yeah.
Break that down for me, how you see that with just a couple of weeks before the election to go.
Well, it's interesting. Of course, if you'll recall, just a couple of years ago, Dave McCormick lost in a nail biter of a Republican primary to Mehmet Oz. And
Right.
I think if Republicans could go back and build a time machine and go back in time, I think they probably feel like McCormick would have been the much better candidate than Mehmet Oz, who was way too easy. Oz, I'm talking about here, to paint as sort of a carpetbagger, a guy from
Yep.
who's not really from here with minimal connections to the Commonwealth. McCormick has proven, I think, to be a significantly better candidate. Interestingly, Casey is still outperforming Kamala Harris, i.e., outperforming the top of the ticket.
Sure.
So he does still lead, but you're right, that race has tightened up some, and that is to a certain extent to be expected. The old expression is that after sort of wondering about whether you're going to maybe vote for the other side or sit things out, many voters at the end of the day come home, quote unquote, and they finally settle in and say, you know what, I don't necessarily love everything about my candidate, but I'm gonna come home and vote for him anyway. And so, yeah, this vote looks to be in the 3-4 percentage point range.
Yeah.
That's the closest I see it, but I've seen as much as 6, 7, 8 percentage point margin as well.
Yeah.
So, with so much polling out there, it's sometimes hard to differentiate the garbage polls from the legitimate polls. They all have a little different way of doing things, and some
Yeah.
of them, frankly, come into it with a real agenda that makes them virtually worthless as a
Yeah.
predictor of what's going to happen.
Yeah. For instance, Fox likes to use the real poll consensus, not all these 20 other polls. Let's take the real. I forget what they call it, but it's it gives a little bit more of a central look at it, that kind of thing. On the ads,
Yeah.
you talk about the presidential ads in Pennsylvania, and I see them. Obviously, I'm in South Jersey now, but I see them from the Philadelphia market, and I
Hmm.
mean, Casey's been pounding away on the abortion issue. He's been pounding away on the hedge fund CEO who took jobs out of the country to China.
Right. Right.
He's been pounding away on where does he really live? Did he live here? Did he live out of state? That kind of thing. They've been
Hmm.
pounding that. And the other side has been pounding Casey about sanctuary cities, about backing Biden's agenda, about all,
Yeah.
kind of other issues attached to Joe Biden. What's your thoughts on the ads so far? And what's most effective, do you think, right now?
Again, hard to say what's actually effective. You're right about where each candidate has gone. The Casey campaign has really hammered McCormick on the abortion issue, which is
Mhm.
fascinating given that Bob Casey has not exactly got a long history of being very supportive of abortion rights. That story's been often told.
Yeah.
But certainly there's research out there that suggests this is where you go, that this is how you attack Republicans, that they will be a rubber stamp for severe restrictions on abortion rights and so forth.
Hmm.
On the other side, you've got, and look, this is always the challenge that any kind of a person who's in a legislative position rather than an executive position, the legislator is constantly voting on one measure or another. On any individual issue, I may have to vote 6 or 8 times on various amendments, various procedural matters, all of which can be used by my opponents to suggest that I was for this, I was against this, I was against it before I was for it,
Yeah.
and so forth. And so, Bob Casey has been around for a long time, almost a couple of decades now, in the Senate. And so you can easily take a look at that record and say, what did you do here? What did you do here? What did you do here? Part of it is probably not all that fair, but again, it's part of the game. When you're
Sure.
one of 100 members of the U.S. Senate, it's not exactly like you're making the final decision on anything. But he's
Hmm.
taken lots of votes, and those votes are all fair game. And so, that's something where McCormick can hammer Casey. Casey doesn't have the ability to hammer McCormick, other than whatever Dave McCormick might have said at a rally, a speech,
Hmm. Yeah.
some fundraiser where there was some audio that was captured that maybe he was saying something
Hmm.
that perhaps was indelicate or controversial. But that's always the challenge for the incumbent, especially a legislator. A governor, remember,
Yeah.
he can push some policies. He may veto legislation here or there. He's certainly
Hmm.
in
Yeah.
favor of this and against that, but he doesn't have the almost daily on the record. You said you were for this. You said you were against that, and there it is, right there on the roll call.
Yeah.
And that's a big issue for an incumbent.
McCormick's softening up a little bit on the abortion issue in the last week or two. He's kind of evolved it a little bit here. I guess
Yeah.
that's what he's calling it. It's an evolution or whatever he's calling it here. Your kind of thoughts, does that help at all? Does that just leave him open to get hammered even more? Like, yeah, you're saying that now, like they're hammering Kamala Harris about. But before, here's what you said. And here's what
Yeah.
you said very strongly.
What's interesting, I think, and
Does that work?
I'm not
Yeah.
going to try to get inside someone's brain in this
No.
particular issue and to know what their inner thoughts were. All I can tell you is that in the
Hmm.
real world, in the
Hmm.
world that you and I live, changing your mind over time because your thinking has evolved, you've had new experiences, you've talked to different people, and changing your mind over time is a fairly common thing to do. When you're
Yes.
in politics, it's deadly.
Mm.
The idea that you didn't have a fully formed set of policy opinions at the age of 25 and you stuck with them then for the next 50 years is somehow viewed, in a whole different way when you're in politics. And
Hmm.
so, but again, look, the bigger issue for Republicans on abortion is this is the dog that caught the car. They were chasing that car for 50 years to try to overturn Roe v. Wade. They finally got it through the Supreme Court, and now it has proven to be a political loser for them. It is something that the polling on this, and look, the polling's been moving this direction for
Yep.
years. It's simply an unpopular position nationally to take away any of these rights that had been enshrined
Hmm.
by the Supreme Court. And so now you've got to kind of work around it. We've seen it with Donald Trump at the national level, and certainly Dave McCormick is finding the same kind of an issue. Now, again, the
Hmm.
peculiar part of this one is
Yeah.
Bob Casey, again, was a guy who was not a supporter of abortion rights earlier in his career, and his thinking has also evolved. Now,
Yes.
again, might just be a simple matter of intellectual maturity and changing your mind in one direction or the other because you gave it more thought. Or it also might simply be, look, I'm not necessarily in favor of policy X, but I represent a commonwealth where the polling tells me that the population is in support of policy X.
Yeah.
So that's the other part of the equation too. Is that a bad thing to say? And nobody's, you know, nobody usually wants to be quite this candid about it to say, I thought this, but everybody else thinks this, I'll go along with them. That sounds weak. That sounds like you're not a leader, but you are representing nearly 13 million people in Pennsylvania. And the polling
Hmm.
here, as in most states, is fairly clear that folks support abortion rights with some limitations, but not a whole lot of limitations.
Hmm.
And so, if you're going to be out of sync with that view, you're going to get hammered for it.
We come down to the end here. Sometimes it comes down to who has the most money to spend on ads in the last couple of weeks. McCormick obviously has legions of money of his own. Casey, I'm not sure where all that money comes from, but I'm sure at a national level they are extremely interested in pulling in as many votes in Pennsylvania as they can to help the top of the ticket and to help him and keep control of the Senate, kind of
Yeah.
thing. Does anybody have the edge there on money? Does anybody have the edge there on being able to run more commercials than the other guy? Or does it come down to the ground game and who gets, again, more people to the polls? And should they be spending more money on that at
Yeah.
this point than on what they're spending it on now, which is an ad every 30 seconds?
Yeah, there's not going to be any issue of getting the ads on TV. I don't think either guy's going to run out of money anytime
Sure.
soon.
Okay.
In terms of what kind of help they get from the national party, what's interesting, of course, we start this scenario in this election with Democrats holding a 51 to 49 member lead in the US Senate, right? Democrats know they're going to lose West Virginia. That's the seat currently held by Joe Manchin, the moderate, some would say conservative Democrat,
Hmm.
who was like a gift from heaven for Democrats, a Democratic senator, that is a Democrat winning statewide office in West Virginia, which is almost impossible to do. He's getting out of the Senate. That seat will go to the guy who is the current governor, who is going to get that seat. No question they lose that seat. Now you're 50-50. So they also, though, fear that they're going to lose, Democrats fear they're going to lose Montana. John Tester is the incumbent there, and he
Right.
trails by a margin that's big enough to make Democrats very worried. So,
Yeah.
where do Democrats pick up seats? I don't think, candidly, Democrats at a national level are super worried about the Casey seat. If they lose the Casey seat, that means they got bigger problems.
Yeah, they're
I
done.
don't think they think they're going to lose that. Excuse me. There's a chance for a pickup for Democrats in Nebraska.
Hmm.
And Democrats, I think, foolishly think they have a slight chance against now I'm Ted Cruz. I'm blanking on his name. Ted Cruz in Texas, and they also think they have a shot in Florida. I don't see either one of those things happening. I think Democrats, that's a pipe dream for Democrats, and
Hmm.
that's a place to just flush money down the toilet. Those are
Yeah.
expensive states to run in. So the upshot is, I don't think the National Party is all that worried about Bob Casey. I think if they've got money, extra money to spend, they're going to shovel it into Nebraska to try and pick something up, and they're going to hope like heck that John Tester can come back in Montana. And again, we could wind up with a 50-50 Senate
Right.
after all
Hmm.
it shakes out. Then, of
Yeah.
course, it matters who becomes president because the vice president then breaks the tie. So
Yeah.
the Senate is just as crazy as the White House at the moment.
Okay. Before we leave for the day, let's talk about a couple of our locals. Sherelle Parker has been on stage at many of the Harris events, and when the surrogates come in, she's also on stage in her first year in office as mayor in Philadelphia. Josh Harris, who's kind of new to Harrisburg as the governor, has also been on the stage. How much political capital do they have invested here? If Pennsylvania were to go Republican to Trump and potentially to McCormick, how does that sit with the folks who are their supporters and the Democratic Party? And if they win big, how much credit do they get and how much political capital do they get if Harris is now in the White House and the two of them engineered a big victory in Pennsylvania?
Well, look, I think Josh Shapiro's on a kind of a run, had a golden run so far.
Amen.
He's run well. He's run really good campaigns, and candidly, he's also run against guys who were, if you were to hand pick your opponent, you know,
Mhm.
that's who you would pick. So he's done fine there. I don't look. There's no question it would be an embarrassment, and behind closed doors, there would be
Yep.
lots of finger pointing if Democrats indeed lose Pennsylvania, and it's certainly possible for that to happen.
Mhm.
That there's no question that Terrell Parker may take some heat, depending on what the margin was coming out of Philly, and that Josh Shapiro could also take some heat. I don't think it's a career ender for Josh Shapiro, for example.
Well, I was going to go there,
But
but go ahead. Yep.
if Kamala Harris were to win Pennsylvania, it's yet another feather in Shapiro's cap. The problem for Shapiro, of course, is that if Harris wins, the Harris Walls ticket wins, then excuse me, losing my voice here. Uh, if that ticket wins, then Josh Shapiro not only waits 4 years for his shot at the White House, he essentially has to wait 8 years
Yeah.
because unless Tim Walz suddenly decides he wants out,
Mhm.
then that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz's ticket would be the ticket for the next two cycles. So
Yeah.
now Josh Shapiro has to wait 8 years. That's a long time to wait for a guy who is as gifted a politician and is as ambitious as Josh Shapiro is. And Josh Shapiro is nothing if not ambitious. So the idea of
So,
waiting 8 years is going to be a real brain buster for him.
all right. So flip it the other way. What if Trump wins and McCormick wins and they get a sweep in Pennsylvania and he tries to run again in 2028 for president? Does that hurt his political chances at that level, having lost Pennsylvania in 2024, if that happens?
I don't and look in from a personal standpoint again, and this is just me,
Yep.
if I'm greedily looking at this, if I'm in his position, that's
Mhm.
almost the better position that the Democrats don't win in 24. That way in 28, Josh Shapiro could run for president. Now, does it hurt him that 4 years earlier the other side, the Republican Party, won his state? Again, it's an embarrassment at the time. I don't know that you're going to blame the governor
Right.
for the fact that, I mean, he's certainly been out there. Whenever
Mhm.
they want him there, he's
Oh, yeah.
there.
Oh,
He's
yeah.
up on stage. He is, as
Mhm.
we know, a very good public speaker, knows
Excellent.
how to work a crowd. So I
Mhm.
don't think that there's much you can really pin. If Kamala Harris loses Pennsylvania, it ain't going to be because of Josh Shapiro. It
Mhm.
may be because of her own failures on the campaign trail, her own policy positions. Could be a million things. Josh Shapiro ain't one of them.
So you don't think he takes any of that blame if it goes down the other way? Trump and
Again,
McCormick.
behind closed doors,
Yeah.
perhaps there'll be some people who think, well, you could have done a little more here, you could have done a little more there. I don't doubt there'd be some of that finger pointing,
Yeah.
but I don't see it derailing his campaign in
All right.
his ambitions much at all.
All right. Can I throw a wild card question in here at the end?
Sure.
If Shapiro was on the ticket with Harris instead of Walls, I think this is a different race in Pennsylvania, and I think it definitely goes in the D column. And I think, to be honest with you, in the choice situation there, I think she made the wrong choice. That's my personal view. I think Josh Shapiro, if Pennsylvania is as important as we're talking about, and it's come true with 2 weeks left to go before the election, I think Josh Shapiro brings Pennsylvania in for Harris and the Democrats.
Well, I don't think there's any question that he would have made Pennsylvania a much easier road. And look, she may well yet win Pennsylvania,
Hmm.
but it would absolutely have been easier if Josh Shapiro was the running mate. But look, I think we talk about this a lot. The
Yeah.
idea of what the vice presidential pick, what if I'm the nominee, what my VP pick is going to do for me in the actual election. It's been ages, frankly, since a VP pick has really made any difference in the national election. Either the ticket won that VP's home state and they would have won it anyway, or in some cases they lose the VP's home state and it didn't do them any good at all. So the idea of them being a real difference maker is pretty unusual. But to your point, I think Shapiro absolutely could have made a difference in Pennsylvania.
Because he's a more dynamic candidate. As a vice president, he's a more dynamic person than any of the previous VPs you want to mention in the last 4 administrations, in my book.
The reason
he
I
knows,
think, though,
and people, when he goes out to campaign, people will listen to him, I think.
Yeah. Here's the problem. All of the reading that I did on this suggests that when the interview process was ongoing, it was clear that Josh Shapiro's ambitions were such that it was not necessarily going to be the right fit for him to take not just the second seat. You're not just sitting in the back seat when you're the VP, you're in the trunk.
Yeah.
And so the idea of that position that sounds great on the resume,
sure,
you are technically the second most powerful person in the world, but nobody really believes that on a day-to-day basis. You disappear for long periods until it's time to cut a ribbon or attend a funeral, a state funeral or something like that. So the thought process of the time was he was just not the right fit for her personality. And I don't mean that as a slight against her. No president wants to be outshone by their VP pick. They just
and
don't
that was
want
a potential here. There's no doubt in my mind that's a potential here. The guy's such a good speaker. He's done very well as Attorney General. He's done very well so far as the governor. The whole I-95 collapse thing was I mean, let me tell you, that was a Hail Mary pass, and he made it happen and got that back up and running, showed his effectiveness. And I think put him on the map nationally. There were people buzzing about him after that. Having said all that, I just think he's a different kind of guy. And you're right. He may have outshone her, and maybe that's why he's not the right pick. I also think he probably thought, maybe this isn't a good idea this time around. Let me back up. Yeah. I'm not saying he backed away or was offered the position or anything, but I could see him maybe reconsidering after the interviews took place and a couple of phone calls about follow-up questions took place.
I've mentioned before that he's an ambitious guy. There's no question about that. His track record shows he is often looking at the next job shortly after being elected to this job. And you can say that's a good thing or a bad thing all you want. But there's no question, just from a practical standpoint, that if he was the choice and said yes, now he must wait 8 years.
Yeah.
And so not only does he wait 8 years, but assuming that 8 years, again, because he's not going to, obviously he has the 4 years initially.
Yep.
She's going to run for re-election. Assuming, again, in this scenario, Kamala Harris wins the presidency, she's going to run for re-election. He's not going to jump off the ticket and run against her. So he's now on the ticket for the second time around. Now, for him to run on his own, you're asking the country to put a Democrat in office for 3 consecutive terms. Well, neither party has pulled that off since Reagan, Bush in 80, 84, 88. So we're going back a ways since the last time the country said yes to 3 consecutive terms for one party. So if he was the choice, in a bizarre kind of way, as impressive as that would be, as much of a an accomplishment as that would be, on a personal standpoint, in terms of his own political trajectory, not such a good thing after all.
Right, take a ticket, you're on the waiting line, right? And that's where you end up. Bruce, as usual, lots of pearls of wisdom from you
Spoken
today.
My voice right out the window there.
I was going to say you won't be any good for the rest of the week in terms of doing interviews, which I'm okay with. I'm all right.
Who says I was any good before this?
You just did my show. I did. I wouldn't have you on if you weren't any good. Don't be ridiculous. Anyway, listen, I appreciate your time and your thoughts and your research that I know you put into this. I know you're doing some work for Fox coming up on the election cycle and election night. That kind of thing. I wish you a lot of luck with that. And I want you to come back after the election and let's talk about what actually happened and kind of the fallout from all that. But I do appreciate your time, brother. As retirees, I know you have other things on your schedule, and I appreciate you clearing a few off to kind of do this. Thanks for doing it. I appreciate that.
Always a pleasure, Dave. We'll look forward to the post-election analysis to see whether any of this stuff came true.
All righty, Bruce. Thank you very much. That's it for the Philly Prime podcast this week. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate that. And make sure you go out and vote. That's it from here. I'm Dave Stratweiser. We'll see you next time.